Good morning, folks. My name is Charles Madden. I'm an elder from Gadigal country. I'd just like to extend a warm and sincere welcome to everyone for coming here today on this sad occasion. On behalf of the Walker family, I'd like to welcome each and every one, my Aboriginal brothers and sisters, non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters. Welcome to Gadigal land, Aboriginal land. If you travel across this great city of ours this morning, the state or this great country, welcome to Gadigal land, Aboriginal land. For any brothers and sisters here from the Torres Strait or further afar across the seas, welcome. On this sad occasion, on behalf of the Walker family, I'd like to wish you all a warm welcome to Gadigal country and a safe and trouble-free trip home. Once again, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Robin Quiggin and I'll be guiding us through today's ceremony. Firstly, I would like to thank Glenn Doyle for his beautiful didgeridoo music and Uncle Charles Madden for his warm welcome to his country. We ask to be welcomed to country by representatives of the clans and nations of Aboriginal people as a mark of respect and in recognition of our past and present day connection with country. I think it is particularly meaningful protocol today as we gather to celebrate and commemorate the life of a man who contributed so much to ensuring legal recognition of the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Australians to their land, saltwater and freshwater country. Throughout his public life, Frank Walker displayed an unswerving commitment to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. In particular, he was a driving force behind the Aboriginal land rights legislation in both New South Wales and Australian parliaments. The New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council recently recognised Frank Walker as one of the legends of land rights. So as an Aboriginal woman descended from the Wiradjuri people of central western New South Wales, I'm honoured to be asked to officiate today as we remember Frank and extend our condolences to his family and friends. Today we will hear a number of tributes to Frank from family, friends and colleagues. Before we commence, I would like to acknowledge the presence of some very distinguished guests who have come to honour this great man and pay their respects to Pam and the family. Commander Paul Doble, representing the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, the Honourable James Allsop, Administrator of the State of New South Wales, the Honourable Michael Gallagher, Minister for Police and Emergency Services, Minister for the Hunter and Vice President of the Executive Council representing the Premier of New South Wales, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the House and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport representing the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable John Robertson, Leader of the Opposition, and many current and former members of both state and federal Parliament. The Honourable Michael Knight is a long-standing close friend of Frank and his family. Michael has shared with me a number of Frank's achievements. Some of them you'll all be familiar with, but some of them might surprise you. For example, just before coming to Sydney to study law, Frank won 2 prizes for very different achievements, although each awarding him £50. The first was for winning a professional foot race, the Sawtell Gift. The second was for winning a poetry competition run by the Banana Growers Association. and we can only imagine that the Banana Growers Association may well be surprised at the way things turned out for their early prize winner. I'd like to invite Michael to tell us more about Frank's years before he entered Parliament and how they impacted on his political life.
Francis John Walker was born in Sydney on the 7th of July 1942. When Frank was 6, he moved to New Guinea with his parents Jack and Mary and his younger brother Robert. The family did not return to Australia until Frank was nearly 12. His experiences in New Guinea and the reason why the family was there had a very powerful effect on shaping the man that Frank Walker became. Frank's father Jack was an active member of the Communist Party. Harassment from the security services saw Jack blacklisted by employers. So Jack took the family to a small village in New Guinea. His job was to recover metal from aircraft abandoned by the US at the end of the war. While Frank was close to both his parents, he was particularly influenced by his father. Jack suffered for his principles, but he did not flinch in the face of adversity. He instilled in Frank a deep sense of honour, an imperative to do what was right and not merely what was convenient. Living in a New Guinea village gave Frank an early appreciation of the natural environment, a cause which we know he was active in for most of his political life. Frank also began a lifelong commitment to the rights of Indigenous people. The Walkers were the only white people for miles around. Frank's playmates were the local village kids, and he taught himself to speak their language. The dark-skinned Indigenous people were the normal ones, and Frank was the outsider. So imagine what it must have been like for Frank to spend his adolescent years in Sawtell amidst the racism prevalent in rural New South Wales in the 1950s. Not surprisingly, the juxtaposition of Frank's New Guinea and Sawtell experiences had an enormous impact on him. Throughout his public life, Frank was dedicated to taking up the causes of disadvantaged people. He never embraced the communist ideology of his father, but Frank shared Jack's passion for standing up for the underdog. When he was 16, Frank and a young member of the Methodist clergy staged a personal protest. They sat with the Aboriginal patrons in their segregated section of the movie theatre. Police removed them and beat them up. No charges, but a good flogging. But Frank was not frightened off, and he spent the rest of his life opposing injustice, authoritarianism and racism. And he was courageous in doing so. He didn't welcome the odium that the social reformer often attracts, but he willingly accepted it as a price he had to pay. Paul Keating, who's with us this morning, used to refer to his friend Laurie Brereton as Danger Man. Laurie, in turn, called Frank Walker fearless. So if Danger Man thought someone was fearless, well, you get the picture. Frank had huge ambitions, but for social reform, not for personal advantage. Frank wanted to change the world, not to conquer it. When he was only 12, Frank decided that he wanted to be a politician, and at the time the two most prominent politicians were Robert Menzies and Doc Evatt. Frank noted that both these men were lawyers and formed the view that if he wanted to be a serious political player, then he too should study law. So Frank found himself a job as an article clerk and enrolled in a 5-year part-time degree at the University of Sydney. Frank initially stayed with an auntie in Hurstville Grove. Subsequent accommodation was in nearby suburbs, and thus establishing the connection that led to him representing Georges River in the New South Wales Parliament. On Friday, the 18th of September 1970, the second Vietnam moratorium protest took place in Sydney. Those of us who were there well recall the police flying wedge which attacked the crowd. While public opinion was beginning to turn at that time against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, the majority of voters were still very hostile to the demonstrators, and they supported the hardline law and order agenda being very publicly run at that time by Premier Askin. So how amazing was it that the very next day, a 28-year-old left-wing solicitor for the anti-war protesters won a by-election in what had been the safe Liberal Party seat of Georges River, and he did this with a swing of over 11%. That stunning victory, and a seat he was to hold for 18 years, demonstrated two fundamental truths that many of Frank's opponents failed to grasp. First, he was the most talented and innovative local political campaigner of his generation. Frank didn't follow the rule book for political campaigning, he rewrote it. Secondly, people liked Frank. You shouldn't be able to pursue a controversial reform agenda, have powerful interests oppose you, become a whipping boy for some sections of the media, yet continually win marginal seat elections. But that's precisely what Frank Walker did. He was able to do this because the people who actually voted in his local elections respected his genuineness, appreciated his efforts, and just plain liked him. Frank Walker was the epitome of everything a modern Labor politician should be. He developed policies within a framework of core beliefs, and he matched that with a rigorous intellectual analysis. Frank didn't need a focus group to tell him what the policy should be. He instinctively knew what was right, or in Frank's case, more often what was left. At the same time, he never hesitated to use a mixture of contemporary marketing techniques to campaign for those policies and for his own election. But those techniques, indeed his own election, were only ever a means to an end. They were never an end in themselves. Throughout his public life, Frank also found time to help younger people active in the Labor movement. For my contemporaries and for subsequent generations of political activists, Frank was our mentor, although he hated the word, our role model, and for many of us also our much-loved friend. Every human life has value. How each person lives their life matters, particularly to those close to them. But Frank Walker lived a life that had a larger meaning. What Frank achieved really mattered. It mattered to the many thousands of people he helped directly. It mattered to the millions who benefited and continue to benefit from the reforms he saw enshrined in legislation. And it mattered to the disadvantaged people he struggled for, many of whom may not even know his name. And that's the life we're here today to honour, and also to say thank you, Frank, for your outstanding contribution, your example and your friendship.
Thank you, Michael. Frank was tireless in pushing through major legal and social reforms. He never rested on his laurels and was always ready for the next battle. Typical of Frank was the day when members of the women's movement implored him to join them to celebrate the groundbreaking legislation he had just put through Parliament to better protect victims of sexual assault. But Frank had to decline because he was heading straight back into the chamber to fight for his bill to recognise Aboriginal land rights in this state. The Honourable Mary Gaudron is a former judge of the High Court of Australia. She was also Solicitor General of New South Wales and worked closely with Frank when he was Attorney General. I now invite Mary to share her recollections of Frank's extensive law reform work. Thank you, Mary.
It is a misfortune that Sir Humphrey Appleby made courageous a term of disparagement. It's unfortunate because Attorneys General must be courageous. They must act independently in the discharge of their functions as First Law Officer. Those duties must be performed without regard to personal or political consideration, with regard only to the law and the maintenance of the rule of law. That takes courage in a politician, particularly if your cabinet or cabinet colleagues have another agenda. Frank was courageous, and because he was courageous, he was a good Attorney General. It's not appropriate, even on this occasion, when we meet to mourn Frank's death and to record his contribution to the law, to politics and to society, to give examples of his courage as First Law Officer of New South Wales. It is, however, appropriate that I state that to my certain knowledge, Frank's actions as First Law Officer were not always welcomed by his cabinet colleagues, and on that account were sometimes to his own political detriment. Well, courageous, charming, a boyish charm that never deserted him, and cheerful, unfailingly cheerful in the face of opposition, adversity, and even tragedy. That's how I remember Frank, whom I met as a fellow part-time student at Sydney University's Law School. It was the 60s. I know we're not supposed to remember it if we were there. But I remember it as a time of idealism, of ideas, of civil rights. In many respects, those ideas, particularly idealism, ruled Frank's life, albeit idealism tempered with a healthy dose of cynical larrikinism. Frank did not believe that all were equal before or under the law, but he believed they should be. And what's more, and a larger proposition, he believed all should be equally entitled to the law's protection. He believed in the presumption of innocence, but he thought if there was to be a presumption of innocence, people must be treated as innocent until proved guilty. As Attorney General, he did much that still endures to give effect to these principles. I mention in no particular order the establishment of the Legal Services Commission of New South Wales for the provision of legal aid with funding secured by interest on solicitors' trust accounts. The expansion of the Office of the Public Defender to represent people charged with criminal offences. The establishment of community justice centres. Two other matters I should mention, one of which is topical even again, reform of the Bail Act. Frank reformed that act to raise a presumption in favour of bail in all cases save that of armed robbery. The second is something that is probably now forgotten. That is the Children's Equality of Status Act, which eliminated legally entrenched discrimination on the basis of illegitimacy of birth, a bizarre expression that thankfully has now all but disappeared from our language. Well, let us turn to equality. It's a concept that's difficult of definition and difficult of application, but you know when it's not there. From a very early age, Frank knew it was not there for Aboriginal Australians. Much has been written and said in recent days about Frank's role in formulating the Keating government's response to the Mabo decision. That response was a brave step which put native title rights on a national and legislative footing. But earlier in 1981, Frank had secured legislative native title rights in New South Wales. Those rights were backed up by a fund consisting of 15% of land tax for 15 years, money that would go to Aboriginal land councils so that not only could they claim native title in respect of unoccupied Crown land, they could buy back their land. That was a bold and imaginative stroke, and it is lasting testimony to Frank's political genius and his commitment to the betterment of our disadvantaged fellow Australians. Although Frank's ministerial responsibilities did not extend to women's affairs, he was acutely conscious of the disadvantage of women within the criminal justice system. Although I think the phrase battered wife syndrome had not then been coined, or if it had, it hadn't made its way into a common language, Frank introduced practical measures to ensure that women who had suffered domestic violence were not further victimised by the criminal justice system. Those measures included the repeal of the mandatory life sentence for murder, reform of the law of provocation, and eventually his actions in ensuring that prosecutors were provided with proper psychiatric guidance and not simply that of the so-called government psychiatrist. He reformed the law of rape by introducing categories of sexual assault and introduced restrictions on the cross-examination of rape victims. These reforms were met with very considerable resistance from the judiciary. That resistance, I am ashamed to say, was as sustained and as disrespectful of the rule of law as was the police resistance to his repeal of the Summary Offences Act and its replacement with the Offences in Public Places Act. The only significant difference being that offensive behaviour no longer depended on the subjective feelings of individual police officers, but on objective standards of the reasonable person. Well, somewhat better received than his reforms with respect to sexual offences were Frank's efforts to improve the status of women within the legal profession. He introduced quotas for the briefing of women barristers by the State Crown Solicitor. He appointed women as prosecutors and public defenders, and was even rash enough to appoint one as his second law officer. He appointed women to the magistracy, and he appointed the first female judges within the New South Wales judicial system. Now, if I were to stop here, you might reasonably conclude that Frank was a soft-centred lefty, committed to improving the lot of the disadvantaged. Well, he was certainly that. But he was more than that. Apart from the doctrine of hodgepodge, which he claimed never to have understood and to have abolished for that very reason, Frank was a sound lawyer. He had a good grasp of legal principle and an ability to absorb the detail of complex legal issues and proposals. He was an energetic participant in the Standing Committee of Attorneys General, where he argued for uniform and national laws on issues that he considered should not be left to individual states. Those issues included artificial insemination by donors and in vitro fertilisation. He argued forcefully but unsuccessfully for uniform defamation laws. He was, however, successful in his campaign for a Uniform Companies Act and for cooperative arrangements for the investigation of offences under that Act. Indeed, as Attorney General and Minister for Corporate Affairs, Frank initiated several important company investigations, thereby securing for himself a number of additional and very dangerous enemies whom he could well do without. Frank's work in SCAG, or Standing Committee of Attorneys General, revealed him to be anything but a parochial states' rightist. He had a national view on many issues and was prepared to work with persons from the opposite side of politics to secure a national response to issues of national importance. Thus, he worked with the then Federal Minister for Business Affairs, Mr. John Howard, to bring about the Uniform Company Law, and with other members of the Fraser government to give effect to the Treaty on the Law of the Sea. Unlike many other state attorneys general of that era, he took a realistic view of the Commonwealth's constitutional powers, even urging the Commonwealth to utilise those powers, amongst other things, to sever the residual constitutional links that prevented the states from abolishing Privy Council appeals and from legislating contrary to a number of imperial statutes that were in force in the colonies. Although those links were not finally severed until Frank had ceased to be Attorney General, his earlier work and his enthusiastic support for the project contributed very significantly to the legislation that eventually secured the constitutional position of the states as members of a federal and independent sovereign nation, and not simply as British colonies. The legal talents that Frank revealed in his work with the Standing Committee of Attorneys General served him well in his later career as a judge, including as a judge of the District Court of New South Wales. In many respects, it was hard to imagine Frank, the larrikin activist, settling into the rather conventional and constrained life of a judge. But he did, and he did so with distinction. His judgments were sound, and his instinctive compassion for people in difficulty ensured that justice was done in accordance with law. Now, on occasions such as this, we tend to console ourselves with statements such as he had a good life or a good innings. Well, the cricketing metaphor is apt, but only in the sense that Frank put a lot of runs on the board and it took an awful lot to bowl him out. But I don't think he had a good life. In fact, I think he had an awful life. He was pursued by vicious rumours in his political life, and his personal life was dogged by tragedy and ill health. But even so, I'm very, very sure that a lot of people have had, and many others will have, a much better life than otherwise because of Frank Walker, QC and MP.
Thank you, Mary. I'm sure any of us involved in the law, public life, or any other pursuits would have to be moved and inspired by the breadth and depth of Frank's work. Thank you. Eric Satie's piano piece, The Three Genopones, was a personal favourite of Frank's. To perform the first of these three piano pieces, please welcome the chair of the piano unit at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, Dr. Paul Rickard Ford. Thank you, Dr. Rickard Ford. The offer of a state funeral or memorial service represents a considerable honour accorded to a person in recognition of achievement and service to the government and community. Frank's family and close friends have asked me to express their deep appreciation to the Premier, Barry O'Farrell, for extending this honour to Frank Walker. The Premier is not with us today, but the Minister for Police and Emergency Services, the Honourable Michael Gallagher, will speak on behalf of the New South Wales Government. I don't want to preempt what Minister Gallagher has to say, so I'll leave it to him to share with us the reasons for his presence today.
Frank Walker was one of the leading lights of the left of the Labor Party, both here in New South Wales and indeed nationally. I, on the other hand, am a long-standing member of the Liberal Party and a Conservative. Worse still, from Frank's point of view, I'm a former serving police officer, a detective no less, and the current Minister for Police. So the obvious question is, what am I doing here speaking about Frank Walker to a hall that includes so many Labor Party luminaries, members and supporters? Firstly, I'm here in a formal capacity on behalf of the Premier and indeed the New South Wales Government to acknowledge Frank Walker's impressive contribution to public life. And I'll have more to say about that in due course. But I'm also here because I was lucky enough to have a friendship with Frank, one that crossed the political divide. Now, I can't claim to be one of his closest friends. There are some limitations that a Labor icon and a Liberal just cannot transcend, but a friend nonetheless. Frank and I shared a passion for the Central Coast. We shared a love of democracy, and we also shared a belief that democracy is best served when people with strong principles and genuine beliefs are prepared to argue from their different views and then let the voters decide which course to follow, when politics is a contest of ideas, not just personalities. And even though I might hold a different policy position, I always admired Frank's passion, his commitment and his ability to articulate a case, more than worthy advocate for his cause, but he also respected the positions of those who disagreed with. Frequently an opponent, never an enemy. When I joined the police force in 1980, it's pretty fair to say that Frank was the subject of many a conversation within the old Sandstone police station at Darlinghurst, where I arrived as a 19-year-old. Every weak sentence, every hopeless law, every decision taken by the government which was viewed as being anti-police was laid to rest at the feet of the Attorney-General. My, how that sounds so strikingly familiar. To say that he became the focus of police frustration with the government was an understatement. But of course, so many of the changes that he made to the way in which police dealt with individuals in custody have now resulted in methods that actually protect police. No longer would police interview juveniles without the presence of a relative or an independent adult. Frank was very concerned about the interview process. He wanted to see those interviews recorded, but technology hadn't advanced that far when he was advocating this case. Once again, Frank was ahead of the game, and now, of course, interviews are electronically recorded. The shameful neglect of Aboriginal deaths in custody and self-harm in general, with the maintenance of a police lock-up system one could only describe as 18th century and barbaric. His undying efforts to eliminate the suggestion that police, on occasions, assisted suspects who were having difficulty expressing themselves. Some might have viewed it as a cry for help. Frank called it a verbal. It's ironic that an ex-policeman gets to speak on Frank's behalf today, but as Frank would quickly return, old habits die hard. Frank Walker served in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, representing the electorate of Georges River from 1970 to 1988. Frank served as a minister in the Rann and Unsworth cabinets between 1976 and 1988. He served with distinction in a range of portfolios. Attorney General from 1976 to 1983, the youngest person to ever hold that post. At various times, Frank had other responsibilities such as Minister for Justice, Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Minister for Youth and Community Services, Minister for Housing and Minister for Arts. For much of that period, Frank was also the Leader of the House, the government's tactician in the Legislative Assembly. And in that capacity, he did on many occasions contribute to the misery of my former parliamentary colleagues whilst they were in opposition. And I can tell you that very few tears were shed on my side of politics when he relinquished that position. Following his defeat at the 1988 election, Frank moved to the Central Coast. Remarkably, he defeated the then favourite for Labor pre-selection for the federal seat of Robertson, a lady by the name of Belinda Neal, and was elected to the House of Representatives in 1990. It was an astonishing comeback. As I stood there at the scrutineers' table at the Kincumber polling booth that night, watching the dreams of yet another hopeful candidate go down the drain, knowing it now fell to me to prepare myself to stand against Frank Walker. Despite having heard his name around police and Liberal Party circles for over 12 years, in becoming the Liberal candidate for Robertson in 1992, I finally got to meet this man that so much had been said and written about over the years. Although our paths had crossed many times during the campaign, including a very heated debate in the Central Coast Leagues Club, it wasn't until the last week before election day, at yet another public debate, that Frank walked up to me and said, "Can I give you some advice? If you don't win next Saturday, don't go back to the cops." He was quick to realise that I had taken his comment the wrong way, and he told me that whilst he didn't necessarily agree with my views on a raft of issues, he did believe in encouraging people to get involved in politics, stand up and argue your position, particularly in light of criticism, and never walk away following defeat. As a testament, Frank's election in 1993 saw him rise to even greater heights when he became Special Minister of State and Vice President of the Executive Council. He later served as Minister for Administrative Services until he lost his seat when the Keating government was defeated in 1996. In all, Frank served as Minister in either state or federal government for a total of 15 years. Very few politicians in Australia would have had longer ministerial careers. I think Billy Hughes' cumulative record may stretch for a longer period, but that's not entirely a fair comparison. After all, Frank Walker was only ever in one political party. Frank subsequently served on the Workers' Compensation Tribunal between 1997 and 2003, where he was appointed to the District Court in the Dust Diseases Tribunal, New South Wales. It was during this period that I was approached by the family of a police officer who had taken his own life. And despite the strength of their case, the family had been denied their claim his mental illness was work-related. After following my advice, they again made contact, wondering whether they had done the right thing, because the judge listed to hear their application was Frank Walker. I assured this police family that despite his reputation as a civil libertarian often prepared to question police practice, he was a fair man, and I had every confidence in his ability to genuinely consider their application. Needless to say, my beliefs were well-founded, and Frank had once again come to the protection of police. Frank's caseload in the District Court was basically in the area of asbestos-related claims. As always, he was diligent, perceptive and committed. His integrity and fairness were never in dispute, though I don't think it would surprise anyone here to say that Frank was regarded as a judge who was particularly sensitive to the plight of injured workers. People knew where he stood. Frank also continued to serve our community in other ways, particularly through his involvement with Schizophrenia Fellowship, an involvement not born out of interest, sadly born out of personal experience, and a subject which Robert Ramjan will expound upon in a few minutes' time. For more than 7 years, Frank battled a range of cancers. His declining health meant that Frank had to retire from public life as a judge and also as president of the Schizophrenia Fellowship. The last of those cancers ultimately took his life. Frank Walker served this state and our nation with distinction. He left behind many achievements, which other speakers have spoken about and will continue to speak about today. Perhaps Frank's greatest legacy is in the area of Indigenous land rights. Frank Walker was the driving force at a parliamentary level for the Indigenous land rights legislation in both the New South Wales and the national parliaments. These fundamental reforms were initiated as a result of campaigns by Indigenous Australians, and they, of course, deserve the ultimate credit. But at the legislative level, someone had to take the lead in convincing a government and a parliament to make those changes. It's a tribute to the maturity of our community that these matters are now essentially seen as bipartisan, mainstream issues. However, at the time the New South Wales legislation was put through, these were much more contentious matters, and Frank Walker showed determination, skill and commitment. It is an achievement our Premier Barry O'Farrell, who kindly let me represent him and speak today, has publicly praised on other occasions. On behalf of the Premier and in the government's role as representatives of the people of New South Wales, I want to recognise Frank Walker's very significant contribution to public life. I also extend to Pam, to Frank's brother Rob, and to their families our sincere condolences on his passing.
Thank you, Minister Gallagher. Our state has suffered a great loss at the passing of Frank Walker, but our loss is insignificant compared to that of his family. However, Frank's family are also enormously proud of his great achievements, and deservedly so. I would like to now ask Frank's brother Robert to pay his tribute to Frank on behalf of the family.
Coffs Harbour High School produced a number of excellent members of society, especially in the 1950s. Frank was not only one of them, he was a special one. The Coffs Harbour High School magazine is called The Beacon. The name was chosen because the dominant landmark in the area is the lighthouse on Solitary Island. On some nights, that light reflected in the clouds over our house on the beach at Boambi, where we lived, and had a warming influence on our lives. In 1960, Frank graduated from Coffs Harbour High School, and in that edition of The Beacon, there is written a short note describing each of the students graduating from fifth year. Under the name of Frank Walker, it says, and I quote, Prefect 59, Vice Captain 60, Football, Star of the Debating Team. And there is a comma between football and star. He was a star of the debating team. English and history are outstanding subjects. I suppose in retrospect the seeds of a legal and political career had been sown at this early stage, and when he achieved a Commonwealth scholarship, our parents knew their gifted boy had a chance to develop his special talents. It is testament to his ability that he did so well at school. We had lived in New Guinea for the early years without schooling, yet when he returned to live in Sawtell on the north coast of New South Wales, Frank soon became dux of the school at primary school and was elected as school captain. The nascent sign of leadership was already being forged. Of course, it must be remembered that we lived on the beach at Boambi in a cottage that was built by a railway worker before the war. No electricity, no water except for rain tanks, and a difficult environment to seriously study, yet Frank did so well. Frank studied for the leaving certificate with the aid of a kerosene lamp at night. That light from the beacon on Solitary Island, I suppose, must have shown him the way as it lit up the clouds above our house at night time. At Sydney University, that light within him began to burn even brighter than the light on Solitary Island. Frank had developed a deep affinity for the undertrodden, the unrepresented people of our community. He had become very aware of the difficulties such people had to deal with in their daily lives from experiences in New Guinea and on the North Coast, where he had a close relationship with Aboriginal people. He was determined to champion the less fortunate people and causes and to bring to justice as soon as possible, as he was able, where it was deserved. Frank had witnessed the displacement of the Aboriginal tribe from Nambucca and the discrimination and segregation within our community. The fire grew, and Frank had the rare ability to bring people with him. He had also had the courage to take on the establishment, and this gave others courage as well to follow him and to support his causes. In fact, he never ceased or waned in this quest. Yet through it all, he was able to laugh at himself, and in fact, for many years, he had on his wall a print by Pablo Picasso of Don Quixote, no doubt to remind himself that the fight would go on regardless of the consequences. Politics is not a sweet and friendly place, especially when you want to actually do things, as many find out. Frank, on the other hand, had no time for those who sat and made no change. He was there on a mission. Many times he rubbed people up the wrong way and suffered retribution, both political and personal, against him. It seemed on many occasions that he was that Don Quixote, tilting at windmills. In the end, however, his reforms were many, and they made this state a country a better place to live in. His quest for change contributed in part to his political downfall, and in the end, factionalism within the party saw him become disenchanted. He moved on to other things, but the light still burned brightly as ever before. The one thing that most affected Frank was the death of his sons Michael and Sean. The tragedy of their deaths was, in my view, the very base of his own untimely passing. Frank, although covering up his emotions, was nevertheless a very emotional man. Whenever things went wrong, he would try to appear unconcerned, whilst deep down inside, he was devastated. The internalisation of this grief and despair had a deleterious effect upon his health, and coupled with guilt he assumed as the father of his beloved boys, the resulting consequences eventually became apparent in the state of his health. After politics, he was appointed to the bench, where he concentrated his unique illumination towards the compensation of injured workers. He also became passionately involved with mental health issues. The Court of Appeal had some interesting matters from the Workers' Compensation Court, when Frank got amongst those insurance companies denying workers their due compensation. Nevertheless, many of his findings on appeal were confirmed, and otherwise unsuccessful injured workers were saved from financial ruin. He threw himself into the mental health issues, working with the Schizophrenia Fellowship and later on the Mental Health Tribunal. The light continued to burn brightly. We went to New Zealand for a holiday in 2007, and the first signs of his cancer became evident. Soon after, he had surgery for bowel cancer. In true Frank fashion, he subsequently developed prostate and esophagus cancers. No one, it seems, developed 3 primary cancers except Frank. He handled each of these invasive operations with courage, and he fought back, recovering after each. I was amazed at his resilience and positive attitude. Things looked good for a while, and we all hoped for a full recovery, but that was not to be. The light, however, never dimmed, and despite his dire circumstances, while gravely ill, he went into bat for 2 magistrates suffering bipolar disorders and called before both houses of state parliament to explain why they should not be dismissed from office. He came out with all guns blazing in his capacity as president of the Schizophrenia Foundation. His first point to Parliament in support of the magistrates was typical Frank, and I quote, "It is not all the judiciary, but all the employers who need to find a better way of dealing with the 10% of people who contact serious work-related mental illnesses than punishing them by arraignment in humiliating glare of the media and then destroying their lives by taking away their livelihood. The better way, of course, is to provide sick leave, pay for appropriate medical care and rehabilitation, and to take them back into employment when their medical advisors deem them fit for work." End of quote. Parliament decided to follow this advice, and the magistrates retained their office. Sadly, last Tuesday night, that bright light began to dim and it faded away from this world. I am sure that his light was attracted to another place and took him into the dream time where there were many others waiting to welcome him. That light from the beacon on Solitary Island at Coffs Harbour still sends its bright light across the dark night sky, and I'm reminded once again of the school motto emblazoned in Latin on the Coffs Harbour High School badge, Luminex Tenebris, which translates light out of darkness. Frank certainly was that light out of darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. The Premier not only agreed to a state funeral, but has also generously allowed it to be a Labor funeral, which respects and acknowledges Frank's political heritage. And in that vein, I invite you to enjoy Paul Robeson's wonderful performance of the Ballad of Joe Hill. It's accompanied by images reflecting both the spirit of the song and Frank's political career. Frank was involved with putting together the program for today. He chose the music and he picked the speakers. Some of Frank's attitudes are reflected in the choices he made. For example, his choice of music that we'll hear as we leave today is Frank Sinatra's "Don't Worry About Me." It tells us a lot about the way Frank wants us to feel about his passing. He also gave some thought to the prospect of a police motorcycle escort for his hearse. And in typical Frank's style, he vetoed it, saying, "I've spent a lifetime keeping out of the coppers' clutches and they're not going to get their hands on me when I'm dead." Michael Deegan worked on Frank's staff when he was New South Wales Minister, and he was Chief of Staff during Frank's period as a federal minister. Mike also became a close personal friend and is ideally placed to tell us about Frank's Labor years. Mr. Michael Deegan.
Comrades, imagine if you can the spectacle of one man before an audience of 1,000 in Mount Isa. At the bowling club, it is hot. They are drunk. They are miners, geologists, surveyors. Three things running in their blood: blue blood, rum and hate. Imagine, if you can, the host introducing the speaker as a member of the socialist Keating government from Canberra. This is the one man determined to stop mining, the man who was going to take our backyards, the man who would give it all to the blacks. Imagine, if you can, that one man standing to address that mob on Mabo and the Native Title Act. We've heard the great speeches of Keating and Whitlam, Kennedy and King. This, though, was very special. This was Walker at his very best. Walker, pure and driven. We've heard about Frank's involvement in Young Labor. Of course, as Rob will tell you, Frank actually hoped to play for the mighty Dragons. But he had two problems. His brother was a better player, and he was up against the immortals, Gasnier, Raper and Billy Smith. Frank always had a backup plan, went into politics. Became president of both the Canterbury Bankstown and the St George Young Labor, with mentors Charlie Simpson, president of the Boilermakers Union, Tommy O'Brien, Sylvia Hale. He was encouraged by Dunstan and Whitlam to help repudiate the abhorrent White Australia policy. And of course, Youth Council then was great training, the cauldron of policy, standing orders and numbers. Walker was not only a powerful delegate to state conference, but acknowledged as one of the senior Labor leaders at National Conference. Through his young Labor days, Bob Hunt was always there at his side and is here today. Halen, Allen, Richmond, Moss, Adamfitch joined Walker in the battle against Keating and Brereton. "Join us, mate," they said. "I'll be Prime Minister," said Keating, "and Laurie will be Premier. Stop running around with Sharney and Gould. Join us." Of course, this was at a very early age. Frank then preferred the broader of mind, although subsequently he and Laurie became the closest of friends. From young Labor with the skills, Frank stood for pre-selection for Georges River, as indicated a safe Liberal seat in the Askin era. The heavyweight candidates against him, Kevin Ryan from head office, very popular, Mick Kalisa, the grouper, Rigby, the Geetsalt steering committee candidate. Sweet, innocent, young Frank Walker trumped a lot of them. He'd gone around and asked for everyone's second preferences. Reference is made to Frank the campaigner. There he is, in the middle of the Vietnam era, Walker a leader in the marches against the Vietnam War, and Askin throwing a heavy law and order campaign against him. So what did Frank do? Countered as always with a local issues campaign. A coalition of teachers, parents, students and the Baptists on public education. A coalition of environmentalists with Milo Dunphy. A coalition on the cost of living. Frank championed local branch members involved in local community issues, a people power approach out of the Oatley School Library. 6 years later, Attorney General, Minister and Leader of the House. Like his friend and ally, Anthony Albanese, in the Federal Parliament today, taking it up to the opposition at every opportunity. But this campaign was not personal, it was fundamental. It was to shift power from those who have and those who crave power to those who needed support. Frank did not patronise the little people. These are our people, he said. The workers, the poor, the disenfranchised, those suffering discrimination and the lonely. This is what Frank Walker and his Labor Party stood for. But Frank was not some lonely light on a hill. Again, as Rob said, Frank brandished a flaming torch, a beacon. "Come hither," was the cry. Frank, in this enormous task, took on and rebuilt the old Housing Commission bureaucracy and started a process of respect for tenants. He engineered a fundamental shift in our nation's First Peoples and their rights. He transformed corporate and criminal law and brought compassion and fresh air to youth and community services. Frank did this by building coalitions, great armies and advocates for change. Walker on the left. Jack Ferguson was retiring as Premier, Deputy Premier. Frank was offered the gig, but with some strings. He said no and ran in an open ballot. He just missed. Frank remained determined to oppose corrupt practices, just as he had at his first Cabinet meeting in 1976, calling for a royal commission into the corrupt New South Wales Police Service. His 18 years in State Parliament were both fun and tough. His opponents threw the kitchen sink at Frank. Police harassing his two boys, regular threats, Nugan Hand, the Botany case, the Love Boat and more. Frank remained true. "Here is where I stand," he said, and his friends grew in dignity, strength and numbers. Frank's support for trade unionism was well known. In his view, these are our people who fought the great battles against those with capital, those people who fought on behalf of working families, the people that they represented and the poor. These are our people who created our great party. "I will not abandon them," said Walker. "I will oppose those who seek to disenfranchise our Labor base." So too with the media. Not for Frank, the weak-kneed kowtowing to the media and the shock jocks. indeed some of them turning kowtowing into an art form. Frank saw this as taking away the very sovereignty of the Australian Labor Party. Robertson. Frank then moved from playing for New South Wales to playing for Australia. First step, minor hurdle, the right-wing candidate for pre-selection had 80% of the vote and was married to the ALP General Secretary. During the ballot, a ship was stopped off Sydney to stop some of Frank's supporters getting to the voting time. Hard and tough, Frank wins. The second step was to win the seat. The incumbent Labor member had run down the electorate. It was a dirty campaign against Walker, including victimisation of his son Sean. Of course, the 1990 Robertson election campaign was one of Peter Garrett's finest political moments. The infamous How to Vote stopped a Liberal Party plot to steal Green preferences. Frank goes into the Parliament and he and his old mate Peter Duncan back Keating for PM. Frank then chairs the Mabo Ministerial Committee, in his words, as Keating's head kicker, turning the Mabo case into the Native Title Act. This built on Frank's first speech to the Federal Parliament. He was a passionate believer in parliamentary democracy. He opposed totalitarian regimes of the left. He sought a fairer, more compassionate society with opportunities for all, the Labor way, passionate support of the environment, and his strongest ambition, and I quote, is to be part of a Labor government that finally delivers land rights to those long-suffering and oppressed people. That speech reflected deep-seated concerns as well about the extent of foreign investment in primary industry real estate, and also Frank's own personal road to Damascus. Indeed, it was the railway between Woy Woy and Sydney. The overwhelming feeling of powerlessness in the electors' minds and the need for real participatory democracy came alive on those rail trips. Frank had many, many supporters and friends. Of course, there were the larrikins, the Labor supporters, the unionists, the public servants, the lawyers and his many Aboriginal friends. His sense of humanity was always reinforced by those who supported the abandoned or beleaguered. Frank never made it as a rugby league immortal, much to his great chagrin. He leaves us, though, as a genuine game changer, a member of that small group, a Labor immortal, a man of the people, a man for the people. My abiding memory will be Frank's grin, part humour, part passion, always determined, but always with that inkling of goodwill mischief just around the corner. My friend, Frank Walker.
Thank you, Michael. Following the great tragedies which affected his own family, Frank was determined to build greater awareness of mental illness and, more importantly, to improve treatment and support for those who suffered from its terrible effects. Frank touched many lives through his work with the Schizophrenia Foundation. Robert Ramjer, CEO of the Schizophrenia Fellowship, worked very closely with Frank and is going to share his thoughts on Frank's outstanding contribution to mental health in New South Wales and Australia.
Frank's involvement with mental illness commenced well before his association with the Fellowship. And sadly, both his sons had a mental illness and both committed suicide. So Frank started his journey in this area, like many other Australians, as a parent or a carer who couldn't get the services that his children needed. This is what led him to the Fellowship in the first place. His first real work for us was to address our national meeting, a meeting of the Mental Illness Fellowship of Australia, whilst he was still a minister in the Keating government in 1995. He was there to talk about advocacy and how we might do better. He talked about the need to be unified, to have clear messages and clear visions about what was needed and not to be sidelined by the minor issues. I can still hear him saying over and over, focus on the major issues, win the big issues. His long service and commitment to the fellowship and to people with a mental illness is incredible. But mostly, I think, what Frank gave us was that he inspired us to be a little bit more professionally and personally in what we were doing. It all sounds a bit cliched in motherhood, but I do think that Frank represents everything the fellowship stands for and aspires to. Frank was always respectful to every person with a mental illness, to every carer. He focused on hope. He encouraged, he mentored, and for that I'm personally grateful. He shared his wisdom and he shared his experience. He gave us hope and he gave us belief. Most importantly, he fought. For those who know Frank well, they know that he could be a fearsome opponent. Once he knew his course, once he knew where he was going to go, he could take on anyone. I think we've heard about that in other parts of his life. In this area, he would take on psychiatrists, bureaucrats, ministers, premiers, even on occasion, prime ministers. His motivation was always to succeed for those that society had cast as the underclass. It was never for personal gain, but with Frank it was always very, very personal. Frank joined the board of the Schizophrenia Fellowship in 1997 as Vice President. He became President in 2000, and he held that position until he had to step down in December of 2011 due to his ill health. He is, and I'm sure he will remain for as long as the Fellowship does, the longest serving President the organisation will have. Typical of Frank, when he did step out of the presidential position, he requested of the board that he be allowed to remain a board member until his death. And with the full and unanimous support of the board, that is what happened. So Frank ceased being a board member last Tuesday. One of the early tasks that Frank undertook was the education of the judicial system about mental illness. Frank was involved in training New South Wales magistrates, district and compensation court judges. He lectured to law students at Sydney University about mental illness every year, including a final lecture in August of 2011, a time when his health was very fragile, but he still had to do it. Frank knew that too many people with a mental illness ended up before the courts and often in prison as a consequence of their illness. And he knew that this was wrong, and he knew that this had to change. This commitment has led to one of the Fellowship's proudest achievements. Frank was instrumental in our advocacy to establish the New South Wales Police Mental Health Intervention Team. This commenced with the Fellowship bringing Major Sam Cochran of the Memphis, Tennessee Police Department to Australia in 2006. Frank took the lead in meetings, argued the case and the model, and with an Australian twist, that model has been adopted. Now, I must add a little bit here because there's been so much said about the police. Frank and I drove down to Goulburn to address the mental health contact officers at a conference in 2006, and all the way down, Frank kept saying, "This is not going to be an easy task. The police don't like me." And when we walked into the room, there was dead silence. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. In testimony to Frank's ability, by the time we left there, every cop in the room was his best mate. The program is in place, and by 2015, 10% of all frontline New South Wales police officers will be trained in the model. I should note further that the influence goes beyond New South Wales. The model has been adopted by the ACT Police and is being looked at in other jurisdictions as well. From the time Frank joined the Fellowship, he was a trustee of the Fellowship's Research Trust Fund, eventually chairing that trust for over 8 years. He served on our national body, the Mental Illness Fellowship of Australia, for over 9 years, much of which he served as a Vice President. Now, the President of that body is Rob Knowles, a past Health Minister in the Victorian Kennett government. Can I say that on both sides was 2 strikes up very quickly, a Victorian and a member of the Liberal Party, a New South Welshman and a member of the Labor left. Frank and Rob formed a wonderful working relationship. Each brought their own strengths to the table, each had the most interesting war stories to share with the other. To my eye, a good working relationship became a very caring relationship, and Rob sends his apologies for today. Frank's leadership of the fellowship helped us through some very difficult times. He had a calmness in the face of adversity, and on occasion, when needed, an outright bastardliness. The ill-formed views of some bureaucrats and their tendency to treat Frank in a less than respectful way brought out the very best in him, often to their ultimate horror. Over the past 4 years, Frank planned and worked towards the fellowship having a sustainable and successful future. He oversaw the development of new organisational structures, new entities, and the establishment of future financial security. In recognition of Frank's tireless and committed work, the Fellowship Board made Frank a life member in February of this year. Frank was many things, as we've heard from the other speakers today, but he was also a very ordinary man. So I can't finish without making comment on Frank's footy tipping. Poor Pam had to contend with Frank and I spending lengthy periods every Friday night during the football season discussing the games. Despite Frank's unquestionable love for St George and my lifelong commitment to West, the Magpies, which should have led to a particular place, we managed each week in the most collegiate way to pick the losers. Frank also had a passion for science fiction and fantasy. We once sat through the complete Lord of the Rings extended version, with Frank going home to Pam at 4:30 in the morning. Sometimes Frank had that twinkle in his eye, and I'm sure people who know him well know the twinkle. It could mean joy, it could mean naughtiness, or it could mean a plot coming together. It was really good to be with Frank when that twinkle was in his eye. Personally, Frank was always a mentor, nurturing, and the best sounding board. An absolute pleasure to spend time with and feel valued by. We had a great time, and I'll miss my friend, my mate, but always carry his lessons and care. I know that he wouldn't want us to weep and feel sad, but he would want us to carry his legacy on. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. This is not a religious service because Frank did not personally embrace conventional organised religion. However, he was still a deeply spiritual person. Before we bid our final farewell to Frank, it is appropriate to give us all a few minutes to reflect privately on Frank's life and each of our personal connections with him. This brings us to the end of this part of today's proceedings. You're all warmly invited to join the family at the New South Wales Leagues Club on Phillip Street, just south of Martin Place, from 1 p.m. to continue to celebrate the life of Frank Walker. Can I please ask you to remain seated until the family has left the auditorium? Then we'll move to the front of the building where we'll have an opportunity to farewell Frank.